text for today's sermon is Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others.
Thank you, Tom. You may be seated. Well, welcome to Friend Day. If this is your first time with us, then we give you a warm welcome. We hope that you'll be inspired and encouraged and visit with us again. If you're here and this isn't your first time to be here, well, welcome back. We're glad to see you as well, and we pray that you'll be inspired and encouraged also. So look at this Peanuts cartoon with me. One day, Linus and Lucy were in a deep conversation, and Linus says to his older sister, "Charlie Brown says that brothers and sisters can learn to get along." Then he continues. He says they can get along the same way mature adults get along. He continues, and he says that adults can get along the same way that nations get along. And then he kind of looks dismayed and says, but I guess at this point the analogy breaks down. Both history and experience tell us that people have a hard time getting along with each other. Nations have difficulty getting along with each other. States and communities have difficulties getting along with each other. Families and individuals have difficulty getting along with each other. Everyone, in every place, at every time, has had difficulty getting along with each other. But doesn't it feel like things are getting worse rather than better in this regard? We live in a time when our nation is so fragmented, and there is so much conflict and so much harm being done to each other. There is the weekly, almost daily reports of sexual abuse allegations, incidents of mass murder and terrorism. Of course, there's the ongoing divide and animosity between political parties and all kinds of disputes along economic or racial or religious or nationality or gender lines. And collectively we wonder, what can be done about this? You know, for thousands and thousands of years, the answer and the fix was wrapped up in knowing God and seeking to put God's principles into practice. God's principles of love and justice and value for all people. Until the modern age, our main sources for the meaning of life were found in religion and in family, and that these were interrelated and they were public matters. In fact, it was not thought good or possible for individuals to find meaning in and of themselves or on their own. Harvard philosopher Josiah Royce, in 1908, 100 years ago, he wrote a book called The Philosophy of Loyalty, in which he sought to answer the question, why human beings need meaning. He wondered why it wasn't enough for us to simply work or sleep or eat and do normal activities of daily life. His answer was that human beings could not live without dedication to a cause more important than their individual interests. He concluded humans need a cause for which they're willing to sacrifice greatly. He wrote that we are happy only if we make our meaning in life something greater than our own happiness. He argued that individualism undermines individual happiness. And I quote, he wrote, "We need devotion to something more than ourselves for our lives to be endurable. Without it, we have only our desires to guide us, and they are fleeting, capricious, and insatiable." But now, for the better part of a century, many of our leaders of our country have been saying that the answer to the meaning of life is not found in religion. And so God has become unwelcome in our public consciousness, in our government and schools. Secular humanism has become the new religion and consciousness for our modern sensibilities. And many people in our day and age would describe themselves as liberal humanists who are committed to science and reason, to progress and the good of humanity, to the rights, equality, and freedom of every individual human being. Secularity is marked by a call to take active responsibility for the progressive improvement of the world, to work for the betterment of other humans, even strangers beyond our shores. And it's argued that removing the influence of religion in the world will help us realize those values. Now, those values of the rights and the freedoms and the equality and the betterment of every human being are values that we Christians embrace. But the question that I would like to raise, and the point that I would like to make this morning, is that where did these values come from? See, not only can none of these humanistic moral standards be proven empirically, they don't follow logically from a materialistic view of the world. The problem and the inconsistency seems invisible to modern secularists. For example, a commentator on a New York Times article about the meaning of life wrote this: "When the Hubble Space Telescope pointed to a black spot in the sky the size of an eraser head for a week, it found 30,000 galaxies, over 13 billion years old, with many trillions of stars and many more trillions of inferred planets." So, how significant are you? You are not a unique snowflake. You are not special. You are just another piece of decaying matter on the compost pile of this world. Nothing of who you are, of what you will do in the short time you are here, will matter. Listen to this. Everything short of that realization is vanity. So, the writer concludes, celebrate life in every moment, admire its wonders, and love without reservation. Now, the first part of that statement provides what we might call a bracing, no-holds-barred materialistic view of the world. Because a materialistic view of the world says you are made strictly of matter without any soul. You are not created for any special purpose. The world will eventually burn up with the death of our sun. And nothing you do here, be it kind or cruel, will make any difference in the end. We came from nowhere. We're here for no reason. We're going nowhere. Accept it. But then, the word so, indicating a logical sequence, the article says we should therefore embrace life and celebrate it and love one another. That doesn't make any sense. There's no logical sequence to any of that, right? If we're nothing but a decaying piece of matter in a decaying universe and nothing more significant than that, how does it follow that we should love one another? It doesn't. If all that's true, why shouldn't we live as selfishly as we can get away with? How do beliefs in individual freedom, human rights, and equality arise and align with the ideas of human beings who came through the survival of the fittest? It doesn't make any sense. Russian philosopher Vladimir Solovyov sarcastically summarized the ethical reasoning of secular humanists when he said this: "Man descended from apes. Therefore, we must love one another." The second clause does not follow the first. If it was natural for the strong to eat the weak in the past, why aren't people allowed to do it today? Now, I'm not suggesting we should eat each other, all right? Nor am I suggesting that we shouldn't love one another, but I'm saying, given the secular view of the universe, the conclusion of love or of social justice is no more logical than a conclusion to hate and to destroy each other. If the values of secular humanism cannot be inferred or deduced from a materialistic universe, then where did they come from? Jurgen Habermas expresses the growing consensus of scholars that the modern ideals of freedom of conscience, of human rights and democracy come from the Bible's teaching on justice and love, and that secular society has found no good alternate way to ground those ideals. Now, none of this denies that science and reason are sources of enormous benefits for us as human beings. The point is that science alone cannot serve as a guide for humanity. And that was well summarized in these words from a speech that was written for but never delivered at the Scopes monkey trial. And the words are these: "Science is a magnificent material force, but it is not a teacher of morals. It can perfect machinery, but it adds no moral restraints to protect society from the misuse of machinery. Science does not and cannot teach brotherly love." So, where then can we find the help that we need to improve and fix our fragmented worlds? And the answer is, the help that's needed is found in an understanding of who God is and who we are as God's creation and what instructions God has given to us for life and for well-being. So we're in this sermon series from Philippians called Joy for the Journey. And the struggle of human beings to get along with each other is not just a problem for people out there in the world. It's a problem for people right here in the church. And in our text in Philippians 2, verses 1 through 4, Paul shared with the Philippians God's prescription for unity. And as we'll see, that prescription includes both the motives and the methods for unity. And hopefully our slides are going to show up here. Let's see if the next one does. All right, very good. Number one, the motives for unity. Paul began his presentation of God's prescription for unity by an appeal to them from the deepest experiences they've had as Christians. And he starts with these words: "If you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from His love, if any fellowship with the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, and being one in spirit and purpose. You notice in verse 4 there are 4 ifs, right? And typically in English, when we use if, we use it to try to express doubt. But that's not the case in the Greek language, especially in the particular grammatical form it appears here. The ifs used here in this Greek form express certainty, not doubt. It's a forceful way of saying, since this is the case, right? So Paul's basically saying, if such and such is true, and I know it's true, then do this, right? Paul's point is built on the fact he knew the Philippians would attest to the truth and the reality of each of these things. Yes, they had been encouraged by their union with Christ. Yes, they had experienced personally God's love. Yes, they had enjoyed the fellowship of God's Spirit. They had received the outpouring of the mercy of God. Yes, those things are true. And since they're true, right? In light of that, it shouldn't be a great thing to ask for you to maintain the unity that God has established, right? An important underlying principle should be noted here. All Christian response and duty flows naturally from God's goodness and kindness toward us. And that's a point that Mark made in the call to worship when he said, the therefore of chapter 12 in Romans 1 is because of the grace of God talked about in chapter 11. Because of that, therefore, since God has done this for you and you've experienced this, what should you do? You should pass it along. Who we are, what we should do and be, begins with who God is and what God's already done for us. The unity that Paul appealed to is described then in 3 ways. First, notice it's being like-minded, unified in mind, having our thoughts fixed on God and His will. Second, it includes having the same love, being united in heart, having the same love for God, and the same love that God has for each other, we have for each other. And then it includes having the same purpose and spirit, being united in purpose, having the same mission and focus that God desires. Now this kind of unity is not uniformity. We aren't all meant to be alike in every way. We're a diverse people, and God made us that way. He created us to be different and yet to be unified. And so the goal must be to have unity in the midst of our diversity. In the church, we have the freedom to be unique, but not the freedom to be divided. So how can we be united in mind and heart and purpose? Let's look at the next verses where Paul gives us the method for our unity. And Paul writes, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. To summarize what the real cause of division and the real cause of strife in the world is, we could define it with a single word. And the word is selfishness. Selfishness is the root problem. And the cause of selfishness is pride. And for most of us, bringing our self under control is the biggest challenge we face. The famous evangelist of old, D.L. Moody, said, I have more trouble with D.L. Moody than any other man alive. I like that. The late screenwriter and musical composer Samuel Hoffenstein said, wherever I go too, and spoil everything. And the former Tonight Show host Jack Parr's classic line was, looking back on my life seems to be one long obstacle course, with me being the chief obstacle. Paul declared we must learn to deal with ourselves in relation to others. Let's examine his 3 suggestions for keeping self in check. And the first is this. Paul suggested that we put away selfish ambition and vain conceit. And the word he used here for selfish ambition is the same word he used back in chapter 1 in verse 17 when he was describing his opponents. And he said that this word denotes a person who has only their own self-interest in mind. By definition, a Christian always has a greater concern for other than just oneself, right? By definition, the Christian must not be self-centered. And yet how sad it is that many Christians are. The second thing Paul said we must not have is vain conceit. This is the person who does everything for personal prestige or for vain glory. They want to appear as something they're not, right? Or they simply want to be admired by others, put on a pedestal. As Christians, our goal should be to advance God and bring glory to our God, not bring glory to self. It's not about selfish ambition or vain conceit or glory. It's about glorifying God. Our goal should be to direct people's eyes towards God, not to have them focus their eyes on us. So the first way to work toward unity and to deal with self is to do nothing. Underline that in your Bible. Nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. The second, Paul suggested to keep self in check, we must practice humility. Now, humility is a hard thing for most of us to understand, let alone put into practice. Our world teaches us to compete against others and to end up on top. And it starts early, doesn't it? One time a woman was babysitting a 5-year-old, and they were playing Go Fish. And like most adults, what do? You let the child win, right? You don't need it for your own ego to win, right? Come on, a 5-year-old? So she's letting the 5-year-old win, and then again and again, and after several games of winning, the little 5-year-old begins to get a big head and says, "Boy, I'm really good at this." And jokingly, the woman said, "I'm going to have to teach you a little humility." And the child said, "How do you play that?" Thinking it was a game, right? "Hey, yeah, teach me humility. That sounds like a fun game." Well, it's not a game. How do you learn to put humility into practice? For starters, we realize and must realize that humility is not self-abuse. Humility is not self-hatred. Andrew Miller said, "The humble person is not the one who thinks meanly of himself." That's not humility. But he said it's someone who doesn't think of himself at all. And I'm not sure that's the best definition. I prefer the one that says the humble person is not the one who thinks less of himself, but the one who thinks of himself less. So it's not that we never think of ourselves. It's the opposite. We don't always. It's not all about us, but it is some about us, right? The humble person is the person who thinks of himself or herself accurately. That's one of the things we tried to learn on Romans 12. Do not think of yourself more highly, but think of yourself with sober judgment. Don't think of yourself like you're a drunk person. Think of yourself accurately. And accurately is, we're God's special creation. He loves us. We're valuable. And everybody else is too. And in view of God, we humble ourselves before God. And we seek to humble ourselves before others. So when Paul says in humility, think of others as better than yourselves, I believe he means to think of others ahead of yourself, right? Don't think of, oh, they're just much better than I am. That's not the idea. The idea is let me be considerate of them ahead of myself. And the old acrostic for joy is a good thing, right? What brings joy? Jesus first, others second, and then yourself last. So it's not that you never think of yourself. It's just that you make sure you are thinking of others as well. And that leads to the last one. Paul suggested to keep self in check, we must place others' needs ahead of our own. The me generation in the United States is the term referring to baby boomers. And that's many of us here this morning, right? 1945 to 1964, the baby boomers. We were considered the me generation because of our self-involved qualities. That's distinct from Generation Me, which is the term given to the millennials. I'm not sure there's that much difference between me generation or Generation Me. There's too much me in the whole thing, right? We have no trouble defining or pursuing our own interests, but sometimes we can have real trouble considering the needs and interests of others. And when conflict arises in a relationship, the parties begin to take up their own positions, begin to defend and protect their own rights and interests. When marriage troubles occur, and I sit with a couple in my office, what do I hear? He doesn't meet my needs. She doesn't meet my needs anymore. I never hear, I just don't know how to meet their needs. That's not what I hear. We note Paul was not saying we should never be interested in our own needs, but we should be at least equally interested in the needs of others. And based on the scripture here, even putting their needs ahead of our own. And of course, the greatest example of all this is Jesus himself, right? And next week, I encourage you to come back. We'll move into verse 5 and this amazing, beautiful hymn, basically, that describes how Jesus put all this into practice in his own life. Did he have selfish ambition and vain conceit? No. Did he consider others' needs ahead of his own? Yes. Yes, he did. He went to the cross for us. And we're called to be like Jesus. Wow. So God has called us to unity in the church, in the home, in the world. And unity is possible with God's help when we live according to his prescription. But without God, and without God's motivation and method, unity and harmony just are not possible. I want to end with a story called the parable of the long spoon. One day a man said to God, God, I'd like to know what heaven and hell are like. And God showed the man 2 doors. And inside the first door, in the middle of the room, was this large abyss. And inside that large abyss was a pot of stew rising in the middle of the abyss. And it smelled delicious. And it made the man's mouth water. But the people sitting around the abyss were thin and sickly. They appeared famished. They had spoons with very long handles attached to their hands. And the spoon could reach the pot of stew, but because the handle was longer than the arms, they could not get the spoons back to their mouths. I experienced this personally when I broke both my wrists, and I had my arms in casts that were fixed at the elbow. If you can't use your elbow, you can't feed yourself. You try to get to the spoon and you can't. And so the man shuddered at the sight of the misery, and God said to him, you have seen hell. Behind the second door, the room appeared exactly the same. There was a large round abyss with a pot of wonderful stew rising in the middle of the abyss that made the man's mouth water. The people had the same long-handed spoons attached to their hands, but they were well-nourished and plump and laughing and talking. And the man said, I don't understand. And God smiled and said, it's simple. Love only requires one skill. These people learned early on to share and to feed one another, while the selfish only thought of themselves. And so life on earth can be like heaven or like hell, depending upon whether we live selfishly or selflessly. And sometimes thinking solely of personal gratification, we forget our interdependence on everyone, so much so that we stop caring about them and their needs. But as the parable makes clear, by doing so, we not only don't help meet their needs and alleviate their suffering, we unconsciously harm ourselves. So in the end, unity and harmony in the church and in the home and in the world is only possible as we love and value our neighbor just as much as we love and value ourselves, and as we practice joy. Joy for the journey. Jesus first, others second, and yourself last. Those values and principles do not come naturally, nor do they become obviously through secularism or humanism, but are given to us by our Creator and are clearly spelled out in Christianity. We need both God's prescription for unity and God's empowerment to make it a reality. And when we do unselfishly love one another, we experience a little bit of heaven on earth. May God help us to put this into practice in the church and in our homes and in the world.